together are needed to constitute a definite logical unity, tied together by the tightest bonds. The logic spells out the problem, its source, its solution, and the means to its solution. None of these truths can be removed without destroying the very possibility of liberation, and no other truth has to be added to them. The four are perfectly sufficient in themselves, and they give us everything that we need to gain liberation. The logic of the four truths is exactly the same as the formula a doctor uses to deal with the patient. When the patient comes to a doctor with a certain sickness, the doctor starts off with a diagnosis. That is, he examines the patient, he takes note of his symptoms, and he tries to determine what is the disease the patient is suffering from. This is like the first noble truth. Here the Buddha sets out the basic affliction of human life, the problem of dukkha, suffering. Then, after he makes his diagnosis, the doctor lays down an etiology. He sets out the cause of the disease. This is analogous to the second noble truth. Here the Buddha tracks down the cause of dukkha. He finds it in craving. As a third step, the doctor gives a prognosis. He determines the possibility of a cure, what must be done to remove the disease. This is like the third truth, the cessation of dukkha. Here the Buddha announces, yes, suffering can be ended. Then as a fourth step, the doctor gives a remedy. He prescribes a course of treatment that can remove the disease. This is just what the Buddha does in the fourth noble truth. He prescribes the Noble Eightfold Path. This is the medicine for curing the disease of suffering. Now we will deal with each of the four noble truths individually, examining each in detail. And we start with the first noble truth, the Dukkhaṅārya Saccang, usually translated the noble truth of suffering. And in the suttas, the Buddha explains this first noble truth simply by listing the different forms of dukkha. Here, I'd like to read just from the text, from the usual sutta. He says, what is the noble truth of suffering, or of dukkha? Birth is suffering, old age, aging is suffering, disease is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are suffering. To be separated from the pleasant is suffering. To be united with the unpleasant is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the five aggregates of clinging are suffering. So here we have different forms of dukkha. First, birth. Birth technically means the moment of conception, the moment of springing up in the womb. In a more general sense, it means the entire process of gestation, from the moment of conception up to the time of the exit from the womb. And here, birth in itself, when it takes place, it becomes a painful experience. Being thrust out from the womb, thrown out into the world, without any choice, without any understanding. This can be a very dramatic experience. In fact, they speak of the birth trauma. And birth is dukkha also, since this is the foundation, the first point for all the other forms of dukkha that will follow in the course of the lifetime. Then after birth, then growth takes place. growth, development. This isn't mentioned specifically as a form of dukkha, though of course this also involves its share of pain and suffering. Then when the maximum point of growth is reached, then aging sets in. The hair turns gray, the skin wrinkles, the teeth begin to fall out. The sense faculties lose their sharpness. The mind loses its intelligence, memory grows dimmer, strength and vitality decline. That's the suffering of old age. Then sickness has various forms, ailments of the body, disease, accidents, injuries, and so on. Ailments of the mind, worry, anxiety, neuroses, psychoses. Then at the end comes death, the breakup of the body, the extinguishing of the life force. Death also a form of suffering. These four items, birth, old age, sickness, and death, these can be called occasional dukkha, since they come only at certain times. Then the Buddha mentions 5 terms which give a kind of overview of the vocabulary of suffering. Sokha parideva dukkha domina supayasa. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. Sorrow is intense woe because of some deprivation of some kind. Lamentation, that's crying and weeping. Pain is bodily pain. Grief is any kind of mental unhappiness. Then despair, that's the very lowest point of mental anguish, where all hope is given up. Then the Buddha says, union with the unpleasant is dukkha. That is, there are various unpleasant situations we don't want to face, disagreeable people we don't want to associate with, disagreeable things we don't want to meet with. We have to face these situations, people and things. We're thrown into contact with them against our will. And as a result, we meet with suffering. Then there's separation from the pleasant. There are pleasant and agreeable situations we would like to meet with, we hope will last. Pleasant people we want to make contact with, to hold to cling to. Relationships we want to endure. But events follow their own law. They don't conform to our will. And eventually